Da skal vi plukke opp, får jeg si, ballen etter Nordshipping. Selv om folk har pakket sakene sine og dratt fra Lillestrøm og Oslo, så ikke shipping uaktuelt, for Nordea ute med en analyse på shippingsektoren, og det vi har snakket om en del på Nordshipping, IMO Net Zero som det heter. Marco Kisic, analytiker for ESG og shipping i Nordea, med oss fra Stockholm. God morgen!
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for having me today.
Very nice to have you. And let's start with you because IMO, and as we heard, there's a Norwegian chief negotiator who sort of landed this back in April as a draft, which in October now can be finally approved if everything goes as planned, as they say. You're writing in your note that, we could see a 30% cost increase in normal fuel for shipping. How much is that going to sting for these shipping companies?
That's right. We think that the preliminary agreement that was achieved in April is effectively a landmark agreement. It's something that just until a couple of years ago it would have looked really unlikely. So we do think that it has the potential to transform the economics of shipping fuel. As you mentioned, we estimate a 30% price increase in traditional conventional fossil fuel oil. But at the same time, the IMO agreement will also quite substantially reduce the price of alternative fuels. So it will really reshuffle the distribution and the relative and economic competitiveness of different shipping oil. So we think that, for example, one fuel that in a way kind of becomes legitimized by this agreement is LNG. LNG so far has a quite mixed reputation as a decarbonization fuel, but we do think that this agreement effectively legitimizes LNG as a transition fuel, of course, as well as other alternative fuels. So we do think that this will really, for the first time, will really kind of step up and accelerate the transition toward alternative fuels. And we think that already from 2028, when the first penalties will start kicking in, we're going to start the first differentiation. And we do think that companies that have already started the work, that already have climate plans in place, that have already started putting orders for their ships, already have a strategy for alternative fuels, they will be relative winner in this race, basically.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. You point to Maersk and the Norwegian car carrier Wilhelmsen as the two of the potential winners in this game. And you have an example of how this is going to hit Maersk as an example, right? They in 28, 29, they might have to sort of sacrifice 10-15% of their EBITDA, which is quite a significant amount of money to fund this transition in their fleet. But you're also writing that it's going to cost them 15-20% to do nothing. So we're talking quite significant numbers then for these companies.
Absolutely. These are significant numbers, which is why kind of it's very important for companies to start acting now. We estimate, the 10-15% increased price related to the transition. The way we estimate it, it's basically, the higher fuel cost, the extra capex of buying alternative fuel ships. But then there is actually, in our estimate, there's a net contribution from the IMO agreement. In fact, if your fleet is really ambitious and green, then you're likely to receive money from the IMO fund. Whereas if you stick to your conventional vessel, to your heavy fuel oil or very low sulfur oil, then you are much more likely to have to pay the penalties. So given that, Maersk, it's among Maersk and Wilhelmsen are two among the most ambitious companies in our coverage. They both target net zero by 2040. They have an absolute emission carbon reduction target. They have very ambitious intermediary and so 2030 targets. So we do think they're relatively better prepared. So we also, that's how we come up with our 10-15%, which includes, a net small positive from the IMO. Whereas, as a counterfactual, we also wanted to see, okay, if these companies didn't take any action, they just continued business as usual, what would it mean for them? Because, there's always the risk that not acting would actually, cost you less than transitioning. Whereas here we think that's very interesting because for the first time in very kind of, real dollar way, not acting and not transition would actually cost you more. So we estimate that if we were to keep the fleet exactly as it is today, so the great majority of your ships are conventional fossil fuel, then the amount of penalties that you would need to pay under the IMO scheme would be equivalent to roughly 15 to 20%. So from an EBITDA perspective in 2028 to 2029, the two are roughly comparable, actually, slightly higher for the kind of status quo, no action scenario. But then I think also what's very important is that if a shipping company doesn't act and doesn't start a transition, then also the value of their fleet would be at risk out in 2028, 2029. Of course, the risk of stranding those assets will increase substantially. So not only you pose your earnings at risk, but there's also kind of a net asset value potential risk in your fleet.
The fascinating thing about this whole agreement is it's not a European system. It's actually a global system under the UN body IMO. Nevertheless, we have a world where we're seeing trade wars left and right. We have China on the one side, which has emerged as a giant shipbuilding nation. On the other hand, we have the U.S., which with a few exceptions, have very little shipbuilding capacity anymore. But are there any chance, as you see it, of the Trump administration or anyone else coming in and sabotaging the system, either before it gets finally approved in October, or somehow after it's approved during implementation, that you could see shipping companies sort of ending up in a squeeze between two nations or two regions here?
Absolutely, it's a very relevant question, and we have been exposed over and over again to the risk of an ambition regulation being proposed and then watered down last minute, if not rolled back altogether. I think, given the context that we are, the agreement that was achieved is all the more, appealing and really kind of interesting because of the environment that we are in. At the same time, though, it was a compromise. There was a whole raft of nations that were hoping and pushing for a much higher ambitions and a much higher level of penalties. So I do think that what we landed is ambitious, but at the same time, it brings a lot of people to the table, and it was able to form a consensus, which is not, 100% consensus, but it's consensus that is large enough to pass. So typically, the finalization, the ratification in October would be a formality. This time, I don't think it will be a formality, so I will definitely be watching it with attention to see what the vote is. It needs a 2/3 majority. The first round was passed with roughly 75 or around that percentage vote. The US alone doesn't have the strength to kind of derail entirely the agreement. So I think that it's also down a lot to Europe plus other large countries that are still around the table to make this happen and to convince everyone that it's that's for the very important cause that we do that. So my base case is that this will pass in October and is there to stay. But clearly, we have been taught that we can never give things for granted. So we will need to continue to watch and see and monitor closely. But for me now, it's my base case is that it will pass and stay as it is.
Before I let you go, I just want to also touch on one thing are the shipping companies themselves, but you're also describing some of the suppliers in this industry. At Nord Shipping, we talked to Kongsberg Maritime, which are obviously seeing a lot of orders and activity, not just for new fancy features for the ships, but also systems related to energy efficiency. In your note, you point to companies like Alfa Laval in Sweden, Atlas Copco, and also Finnish engine manufacturer Wärtsilä, who are making money on both carbon capture, retrofit systems. Are those the three main suppliers you see in the Nordics making a big buck from this?
Those are the three kind of, most immediate names and kind of most directly exposed. We do think it's very interesting that from this agreement, we expect the entire shipping value chain to be impacted, and a lot of players, particularly the ones that are able to offer and tap into that low carbon value chain, to be benefiter. One point that we flag, particularly in our analysis, is that renewed role of LNG. LNG has been a bit in a limbo for the past years because of the decarbonization potential of the fuel. It's fairly modest. We're talking about between 0 and 25% decarbonization potential, which perhaps it's not is not entirely future proof. But with this agreement, again, around along the lines of the compromise that I talked about before, I think that the IMO decided that we need to be realistic, and we want to give some time to the to the global fleet to adapt. And therefore, for the next few years, we're going to allow LNG ships to be basically part of the agreement. And that to me is quite interesting, because it triggers a number of LNG suppliers like Alfa Laval, like Wärtsilä, who are capable and to provide LNG engines or
so how strict are the new rules? Do you have to be all in on LNG, or are you allowed to run some kind of dual fuel, or is this just sort of camouflage where you're allowed to run as before, but you have LNG as backup? What are the devil is in the details here?
Absolutely, no, it's a good question. It's a good question, and I think that one very interesting thing of this agreement is the units that it targets. And it's the carbon intensity which is expressed. This is a bit technical. It's an important detail. Is expressed as grams of CO2 per megajoule. So it doesn't matter so much. Often, on the other hand, the intensity is calculated based on ton nautical miles, which is a work transport dimension, which you can optimize, for example, by running your ship slower, loading your ship more effectively, and so on. Whereas this agreement is very much focused on the actual intensity of the fuel they use, i.e. on what fuel do you effectively use in your trips. So companies are going to have to submit the data at that level. How many grams per megajoules did my ship consume? So you can't have a dual fuel ship and run it in another fuel and you'll be okay. You will actually need to prove that the fuel that you used during those trips was X. And of course, ships will, optimize their fleet, because this is going to be done at fleet level for a company. So they will, some of their ship will continue to run, conventional oil, but they particularly expect the new ones will be pushed to adopt either LNG or methanol or other alternative fuels.
Marco Kisic in Nordea, thank you so much for joining us from Stockholm today, and we'll keep an eye on these earnings results from the shipping companies moving towards the fall to see what they write. For å se mer, klikk deg inn på FA.no/TV, eller se oss på storskjerm når du vil ved å søke opp Finansavisen på din Apple TV.